I think this is a very middle to upper class achievable goal of a functional family. I think it is very hard. Like, I'm having like discomfort at like, I think that this basically puts like, are you poor and you can't afford things? Then you're in the bucket of you're a dysfunctional family.
Yeah.
Like, there is a disproportionate amount of people who like will not maybe be able to provide like warmth in the winter, will not be able to like, and that, I don't know if I'd call that a dysfunctional family. Like, you could be a very...
How about a deficiency?
Yeah, right? Like, it's like, you I'm sure you are aspiring to do better, but I feel like to be like, you're dysfunctional unless you live in a like...
So you just mean because of the, like, the connotation, the harshness of the term.
Yeah.
It's not that you're saying it isn't objectively bad. You're just saying that sounds too judgmental.
Yeah, because like dysfunction like implies like a...
Yeah, I just literally just mean like in a totally clinical way. Like, you're either functioning or you're dysfunctioning.
Yeah, and I think that's like a provocative term. That...
Okay, yeah. So what term would be less provocative and just like be a more clinical, academic sort of like, is this healthy or unhealthy? Is this good or bad? Is this positive or negative? Or it's like, it is optimal or deficient.
Yeah. I feel like optimal might be it, right? If you're aspiring for like the optimal family.
Yeah. Which is, and there is another sense in which, even though I'm trying to assert that these things can be measured objectively, that isn't the same thing as saying they don't take into account context. Mm-hmm. And so it might be a matter of just acknowledging different people are trying to overcome different challenges and have different opportunities and, opportunities available to them.
Right.
And so the other thing would be like, depending on socioeconomics and where you are in history and where you are geographically, like what it looks like to provide shelter is going to be very different, right? Like,
right.
Like in the Caribbean or on the Hawaiian Islands, like what you need to provide shelter there is different than what you need to shelter in Alaska. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is, so I'm not saying like, no, there's one right kind of way to build a house. I'm not saying that kind of like cookie cutter objectivity, but I am saying if you take into account all of the considerations, you can determine, is this or is this not serving the needs of the members of the family?
Mm-hmm.
Welcome. I'm so glad you could join us. Please come in. Your presence honors us. Here at the Mr. Homemaker podcast, we share our stories and challenges, collect the best expert advice, and offer one another support as we learn to manage our households. Your perspective and contributions will be very valuable. And just in time, today's discussion is about to begin. It is my pleasure to present Mr. Homemaker.
Thank you for joining me for this week's discussion of the purpose of family. If you are a young man interested in becoming a successful husband and father with a healthy and fulfilling marriage and family life, then you are in the right place. Anyone else is welcome to join us as well. If you're just learning about the Mr. Homemaker podcast and YouTube channel, I invite you to go back to listen to our premiere episode of Season 2, where we explain the backstory that brought us here, the goals for this season, and the approach that we will take. As we pursue our goal for this season of establishing the mindsets and strategies that will lead to success as a husband and father, we have to begin defining what success looks like. This week, we need to define success for the family. Success, or the proper functioning of any institution, is determined by understanding the ends, the outcomes, the purposes it is meant to fulfill. Turning to sociology for a definition of family, we find a group of people who share emotional, material, and financial resources, which tells us what a family does, but not why it does it, or what it is trying to achieve. Sociology offers a goal of providing for the well-being and mutual support of the members of the family. This is beginning to answer the question, but not providing us with enough detail that we can get a clear picture of what it looks like, or evaluate whether a particular decision or action, strategy or mindset is conducive to or destructive to achieving this end. We need to offer a more detailed understanding of what constitutes well-being or human flourishing. To fill this gap, we turn to Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In its classic form, Maslow's hierarchy consisted of 5 layers, where the bottom layer, the first, was the most fundamental. And as each level of needs were met, the individual progresses to address the subsequent higher level of need. The first layer is physiological needs. The second is the need for safety. These two are our basic needs. The third level is love and belonging. The fourth is esteem. Love and belonging plus esteem constitute our psychological needs. Maslow's classic hierarchy terminates with the 5th level of self-actualization. By substituting Maslow's hierarchy for the generic description of the family that it provides for the well-being of its members, we can start to get a clearer picture of what a well-functioning family looks like. It is one where the members are shepherded through Maslow's hierarchy to ultimately achieve self-actualization. This is particularly intuitive when we think about a child born into a family. A newborn is exclusively concerned with physiological needs, and only as it reaches new developmental milestones does it become either intuitively or consciously aware of higher level needs, including love and belonging and esteem. In adolescence or young adulthood, under this model, a successful family is one that has provided the individual with all the resources they needed to progress up through this hierarchy and be fully equipped to undertake self-actualization as an adult. Looking beyond the case of a child born into the family, it would also follow that a well-functioning family is one that continues to cultivate the well-being, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs for the adult members of the family. But as we take a step back and consider the family in context, with the paradigm of structuralism that we discussed last episode, we can further deduce that a functional family, a successful family, is one that contributes to the effective functioning of its neighboring families, both physically in a geographic community, as well as other nuclear families in the extended family tree. Our next deduction is that a successful family is one that produces adults who are able and willing to be contributing members of society at large. Finally, it follows by the same logic that one of the purposes of family must be to produce adult children who are able and willing to establish well-functioning families of their own. By considering not only the members of a nuclear family, but also the relationship of that nuclear family to other families, we can begin to see an objective standard by which we can evaluate whether or not particular mindsets, strategies, lifestyles, and outcomes are either conducive to or detrimental to human flourishing, whether or not a particular family is fully functional or is in some way deficient or dysfunctional. By fleshing out a definition of the purpose of family through these lenses, we can begin to arrive at an objective standard by which we can know whether or not a given strategy and mindset lead to success as a husband and father, the proper functioning of a family, and which mindsets and strategies lead to dysfunction. Please bear in mind that I'm using the term function and dysfunction here in a clinical, impersonal way. There are a myriad of considerations and contexts that will shape what success looks like for a particular family. So while I advocate for an objective view of reality, including an objective definition and evaluation of success, that is not the same thing as advocating a one-size-fits-all definition. Nor will this approach provide a model that is inclusive of all possible structures and compositions of a family. That is not my objective. My objective is to develop an archetypical family model. It is an abstract theoretical concept, not descriptive of the multiple permutations of scenarios that exist in the real world. The approach is to adapt the theoretical to the actual, the abstract to the concrete. But we must begin with understanding what that theoretical model looks like. Let me pause to be clear that this model of family is not meant to be all-inclusive of every real-world situation in which people find themselves. It is meant to begin establishing an abstract model of an archetype of a family. Only by understanding the abstract, the theoretical, the conceptual measuring stick can we then proceed to evaluating real-life mindsets, strategies, and outcomes against that theoretical ideal or archetype. Let me also clarify that while I maintain a perspective, a paradigm of trying to get at objective reality, that does not entail an assumption that there is a one-size-fits-all answer to any particular question. Objectivity is not the same thing as uniformity, but it does mean that given a context, given particular considerations and scenarios, a reasonable person should be able to deduce what is objectively good or objectively functional versus what is objectively deficient and dysfunctional. To further
Hello.
Kristen, thank you for being here.
You're welcome. As you can see, I'm fully camera ready.
Yeah, we're doing this right after Saturday morning workouts.
Yeah. I really tried hard. I was like, well, a couple things. One, I forgot that we do this on video now. So when you could ask me, like, are you going to shower? And I was like, no, what does it matter? Like, no, I'll do it later. And I was like, I don't know, I might like do an extra yoga before, because I didn't get a really good run because the kids came and it was really tough. They stop a lot.
Yeah.
And so, speaking of, in terms of today's topic, I have already some thoughts on that issue. But so I was like, I don't know why you're pushing a shower so much. And then I realized because we were going to be on camera.
Yeah,
and
welcome to our new life. Yeah.
This is it.
Season
we're
2.
Be real.
It's all video now. Yeah.
So I'll try better next week. But for now, we only have about 60 to 90 minutes during which our youngest is napping, and I could not squander 30 to 45 of them taking a shower. So here we are.
Thank you for being flexible.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so any questions, comments, concerns about my presentation of this theory of the purpose and dimensions of a family relative to individuals and society?
No.
Oh, that was easy. Good. High five.
I feel like that was a really comprehensive look. I think where the interesting piece comes in is the deeper dive into some of the things about like psychological needs of the family and self-actualization.
Yeah.
Especially as you start to raise children, and the kind of natural tension between helping them to build their both self-esteem and esteem within the family, while also providing parameters and corrections of like the other piece, which is we need to teach them to be functional members of society. And so like how do you how do you help a child to feel that sense of self-esteem and that they have an importance in the family when you're also like, don't do that, like stop, like kind of always telling them they're wrong.
Yeah.
And so
you're just getting into like the strategies and techniques of parenting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing that we could talk about. One thing I thought was really interesting is when he started talking about purpose of a family, I just wrote down to provide a safe place from which the members can flourish. I didn't think about the interconnectivity with neighbors, though that is an intrinsic part of our belief, right? Like we really want, the reason we moved where we did and in the kind of house that we did, which is very close to our neighbors and almost like, like one step away from city living, what we used to do. I think that we recognize that like there is a need for much more connection between like from neighbor to neighbor and family to family, but I don't think that like that, to me, I would have defined that as the part of the purpose of a family.
Yeah. No, I think it has to be part of the actual purpose. I think that we've talked about it before in the context of like there are benefits to the family and the individual to have like strong community bonds.
Right.
Like it is enriching.
Yeah.
But I think I'm suggesting a model that takes that a step further of like, no, it is actually like an essential element of a family is to cultivate connections between that family and adjacent families in the community.
Right.
It isn't just like an optional nice to do, it's a essential element. If you aren't doing that, you're not fulfilling an essential element of family life. So if like we chose to just be like, yeah, we send our kids to school and we go to work and then we all come home and we like lock all the doors and close all the windows and we never interact with anybody, like I would say that's a dysfunction. Believing in objective reality and like human nature and human flourishing, I'm asserting that you can say we're a family. What you can't say is our family's doing it well. Like, well, that's an objective question. But you can't say like our family, this is how I want our family to function. This is healthy functioning of our family by my definition. Like you don't get to choose your own definition of healthy family functioning.
So you're saying, but if you think all of those other things are fulfilled.
Because basically I'm saying anybody can evaluate a family is an object in the same way that you can go to a physician and they can tell you objectively whether or not like your blood pressure is at a healthy level.
Yeah.
We can objectively determine, Are you effectively sharing your material, emotional, and economic resources? And are you achieving the ends, the goods, the purposes of the family? Which goes back to, with relation to the individual, are you helping these individuals satisfy Maslow's hierarchy of needs? And is your family having a beneficial and, synergistic dynamic with other families? And are members of your family becoming net contributors to society? And all of those are objective questions. I'm just trying to drive home the objectivity of it, that it's not a matter of like, you get to pick. They just can't choose to say, no, we made up our own Maslow's hierarchy.
Right.
Or, yeah, some people might think that this is dysfunctional or toxic or parasitic or exploitative, but we don't feel like it is. Like, no, objectively it is. This is not an acceptable family functioning.
Yeah.
I mean, which I think in some sense we all subscribe to this, which is why we have like child protective services.
Right. Because
people aren't really willing to like protest the idea that the government should be able to come in and say, this family is so dysfunctional that it isn't safe for these children to be here.
Right.
Some of us might think that the state oversteps in that role, but I have never heard anybody like, picket outside child protective services and be like, this government agency shouldn't exist because children are the property of their parents and we can do anything we want with them or something. You know what I mean?
Right.
Let us pause for a moment to extend our sincere appreciation to those who make the Mr. Homemaker podcast possible.
This week, we'd like to thank all of our patrons who have supported us through Season 1 and this transition to Season 2, including Colin, Mary Jo and Paul, Cassie, Heather, Ted, and Barbara. Thanks to your support in August, the Mr. Homemaker podcast has donated to Child and Family Charities of Michigan, with a mission to strengthen and support children, families, and individuals. Child and Family Charities of Michigan has supported over 7,000 children, youth, and families each year. Finally, thank you to our entire audience for continuing to listen each week. To help us reach more couples trying to navigate these challenging times, please like, subscribe, and share this podcast or YouTube episode with your spouse, relatives, and friends.
The discussion is about to resume. Please take your seats and give your attention.
So, is there anything that jumps out at you that you think of any examples of when you, in your own mind, when you think about the difference between like a healthy family versus a unhealthy or dysfunctional family as it pertains to like the basic needs of physiological and safety needs on Maslow's first two levels of his hierarchy?
I mean, I think those are pretty self-evident, right? Like I don't really think I have anything enlightening to share.
Yeah.
About food, water, warmth, and rest. Like, I think that's do you have?
Well, one thing that, I'm thinking out loud here, but one thing that does occur to me is if a family is like cultivating poor diet, like you're providing food, but it's not healthy food, I would say that is a form of family dysfunction, like a family that is chronically eating unhealthily is a dysfunctional family. What do you think about that?
I think this is a very middle to upper class achievable goal of a functional family. I think it is very hard. Like, I'm having like discomfort at like, I think that this basically puts like, are you poor and you can't afford things? Then you're in the bucket of you're a dysfunctional family. And like,
yeah, no, interesting. I mean, I'm not sure if that's true. Like, poor people who live on farms have like organic free range food available all the time. They're not eating McDonald's, right? They're poor.
Right. So, but I'm not asking those people. I'm saying that like there is a disproportionate amount of people who like will not maybe be able to provide like warmth in the winter, will not be able to like, And that, I don't know if I'd call that a dysfunctional family. Like, you could be a very...
How about a deficiency?
Yeah, right? Like, it's like, I'm sure you are aspiring to do better. But I feel like to be, like, you're dysfunctional unless you live in a, like...
So you just mean because of the, like, the connotation, the harshness of the term.
Yeah.
It's not that you're saying it isn't objectively bad. You're just saying that sounds too judgmental.
Yeah, because, like, dysfunction, like, implies, like, a...
Yeah, I just literally just mean, like, in a totally clinical way. Like, you're either functioning or you're dysfunctioning.
Yeah, and I think that's, like, a provocative term. That...
Okay, yeah. So what term would be less provocative and just, like, be a more clinical, academic sort of, like, is this healthy or unhealthy? Is this good or bad? Is this positive or negative? Or it's, like, it is... Optimal or deficient.
Yeah. I feel like optimal might be it, right? If you're aspiring for, like, the optimal family.
Yeah. Which is, and there is another sense in which, even though I'm trying to assert that these things can be measured objectively, that isn't the same thing as saying they don't take into account context. Mm-hmm. And so it might be a matter of just acknowledging different people are trying to overcome different challenges and have different opportunities and, opportunities available to them.
Right.
And so the other thing would be, like, depending on socioeconomics and where you are in history and where you are geographically, like, what it looks like to provide shelter is going to be very different, right? Like in the Caribbean or on the Hawaiian Islands, like, what you need to provide shelter there is different than what you need to shelter in Alaska. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is, so I'm not saying, like, no, there's one right kind of way to build a house. I'm not saying that kind of like cookie cutter objectivity, but I am saying if you take into account all of the considerations, you can determine, is this or is this not serving the needs of the members of the family?
Mm-hmm. One thing that I realized does not naturally fit here is, like, the health of individuals. Like, you could put it in physical safety, but, like, if we're, like, it doesn't talk at all.
You mean like the medical health, like the athletic, that kind of stuff?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that does go under physiological, but you're right. It's not explicitly listed there.
Right.
I would just put that as, like, part of your foundational bottom level.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because, I would argue that is, right, like, if you're neglecting the health of your family, that makes the other things difficult to achieve.
Right. Okay, good. Now, on the safety thing, one thing I'll say is I tend to think about all of this in a, like, hypothetical Hobbesian state of nature kind of way. Like, imagine, like, try to strip away all the assumptions you have about modern living. Mm-hmm. And, like, the relative, privilege of, like, lack of crime and violence and, we're not worried about being invaded every day kind of stuff.
Right.
There's a, professional police force in our town, that kind of stuff. But in theory, the obligation to provide for the safety and security of all the members of the family is a responsibility of the family. And you can only neglect that insofar as somebody else has fulfilled that need for you, right? If, like, the...
Right, meaning, like, you can't control... So, like, if you live in, what is it, Colombia or Honduras, like, the murder capital of the world. Yeah. If you live in that location, the physical safety thing is, like, not the, like, achievement of safety. It is your obligation, or your obligation and your ability to attempt to safeguard your family, right? Like, if they're, like, corrupt police, you can't be a dysfunctional family because... Oh, right. Like, your state can't provide for your security.
That doesn't make you dysfunctional.
Right.
But what it does mean is, I would submit, that the family has to take more responsibility for meeting the safety and security needs of its members than it would if it's like, well, I live in a place where that's taken care of for us. That's just like we all pay our taxes and there's a policeman who patrols the block. Mm-hmm. But if you live in a place where that doesn't happen, then it devolves back to, like, this is a family responsibility, is to protect the family.
Right.
Well, and in doing the research for this, like, one of the anthropological authorities a cultural anthropologist named David Levinson, when they were talking about like how families form and behave over time and places, like 70% of societies, according to Levinson, exhibited patrilocal residence patterns, which meant when people got married, they settled down near the husband's family. And Levinson reasoned that that coincided with and was like rooted in the historic need for men to band together to protect their communities. And so it was natural to think like, well, I a grown man, was raised in a family and in a community where I'm already part of like essentially the local militia, for lack of a better phrase, right? And so it was naturally like, well, I'm going to bring my family inside the protective bubble of this, community that I already am part of the protective network for.
Yeah.
Whereas if you, in that scenario where you had a more real fear of like external threats, it would not be efficient. Like your society would be more vulnerable if men were constantly being like split off from their network of male counterparts who they like coordinate their efforts to provide for safety and security. So again, that's one of those things where like I think we've gotten away from that like patrilocal settling in the affluent West because we're not as worried about like I'm not so worried about my town being overrun.
Right.
If I were, I'd be like, well, I'm not so sure that we should be here by ourselves, or you know what I mean, like it would drive different patterns of like where people live and how they interact.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you want to say about physiological or safety needs and the family's responsibility to meet them?
No.
Okay. How about belongingness and love, intimate relationships and friendships? What are your thoughts about the role of the family to provide or foster, cultivate those things for their members?
I mean, so when I define the purpose of a family, like that's where my head goes, and probably because I have lived a life where like the first two were taken for granted, right? Like,
sure.
So it allows me to get to the psychological needs of the like the sense of belonging and love that a family creates.
Yeah.
I think when you read about the increase of gun violence, of young people committing crimes in heinous ways, I do often wonder if that is a result. It seems to be those people are always like loners that really didn't have that strong family like tie and love and that, and so I'm not saying if you don't have that you will become like, I just want to be clear, right? But I'm saying that is that where you do have that, it is less likely that somebody is disenfranchised, right? Is it because I feel like, I think about a lot like our kids growing up, right? And like there's gonna come a point in time where there's gonna be a bully, or there's gonna be someone who doesn't like them, or right? And like, or they're gonna struggle with something. And so for me, like the thing that I want to provide most primarily for our children is a place where they feel like they can come and be themselves and be fully loved and understand what that feels like, because I think that's the foundation to them as they move on, to be able to find that and recreate that themselves for their families, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
Because they can see what they deserve and what a family should be like, and then model that going forward. So this is like a really important one for me. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd like you to say more about, I think you said a lot about like the creating a sense of belonging and love, like affection within the family. But again, going back to like how this relates to adjacent and broad, adjacent families and broader society, I'd like you to expound on your thoughts about like how a family like socializes children to be good friends and good members of a community.
Right.
What are your thoughts about how that looks? Or
I mean, again, I think a lot of it is just like modeling and it has to become it should become an ingrained part of who you are, right? We've talked a lot about like whether it's, so a couple of things. One, we chose a community, and I don't think we fully understood it until we were here, that like people are proud of where they are from.
Yeah, right.
Side note, this is why I have a big problem with professional sports and how we like buy, like part of that, like, you know, like all these are all things that were designed to help reinforce common bonds and build relationships among people that maybe didn't have as much in common or needed something to celebrate it, right?
Right.
And now we just like buy our professional sports players, like put them on teams, like that guy's not from here, I don't care.
Right.
But like our town, like everybody wears like town hats, and they're like all the kids are always in their school gear, and like people
flying flags.
Right. There's like a 15-year-old kid that started a business like that is like that's basically founded in like how much like we all love
our local
the beach and the community. Yeah. And so I think that, you know, we naturally gravitated toward a place that had that community spirit and people that really want to feel a part of that, right? It's the reason why I, too much to my father's chagrin, I became a Red Sox fan instead of a Mets fan, right? Because as Mets fans, like I don't remember, like because there's where I live, there's Mets and Yankees, right? And so there's like there's like fans, but I never felt that sense of community that you do when you like live in Boston and go to Fenway Park, and like everybody's like it is a common bond that like people have. It's something that no matter where you go, no matter how nice a restaurant is, like if the game's on, people are like, hey, do you know the score of the game, right? And it creates that like kind of like joyful bond amongst one another. It's the reason why church, I think, is a really important thing for people, because again, it's like another collective place where you feel that sense of belonging through tradition and through, you know, things that you know, everybody says the same prayer, everybody does the same things for the holiday, and like, so I think again, like that we crave that sense of belonging, and so I think that there's lots of ways that you create that, you know, as in your community. I think there's the other piece of that, which is like I want my children to also recognize like our obligation, our duty to help others that, for, you know, like either don't have what they need or, you know, psychologically need more help or whatever it is, right? And like, so I think like that's another way that you build those community bonds. One thing I think that that's really kind of a...
So, I mean, so far you've said like modeling, like you said things you want to model, or like the aspects of developing these things in children. But like even like modeling, like what does that look like practically speaking in your mind? What does it look like to model that? Because and the reason I ask is because as opposed to like talking to kids about it, if you're modeling it, I'm trying to like picture a scenario of like, we're going to take our kids with us to go do it. Like, what does that look like? Like, tell me a story, paint me a picture here.
Sure. I mean, whether it's like, so when we got here, I immediately joined the parent-teacher organization, and
but like our kids don't see you do that.
Well, but they should, right? Like they don't yet. They know that I do it because I like step away, and it's a little bit different because we are still in the tail end of COVID, which I don't know if there'll be an end, but like so there are not as many in-person activities that I could like take one of them with me to go do, right? But like when our town had like this huge week of activities, like we were here doing all of the things and getting to know the other families. I think from a volunteering perspective, like doing things that your children can be a part of and do with you. And again, it's just been a weird time because like we haven't been going up until like this summer. We really weren't doing things in person, and then summer's just like crazy, right? But just bringing them along to do those things and to see, even just like we're on the trail like in our neighborhood, and I'm like picking up the garbage that I see, right? Like, because as part of a community, like that helps the health and well-being of our community. I realized later that like you gotta be really careful with that, because then your kids like start picking up stuff. You're like, oh God, don't touch that. I should like always have gloves, but yeah, so I think it's really just about like,
look, I found a needle.
I don't think that and I'm thinking about our really good friends from home that like their children are such like empathetic and good kids, and they are such like a good family. They really are all about like, they are so selfless in everything they do, and I think their kids just, it's not like I'm sure they talked about it with them, but it's because they do it, they model it, right? Like you go to their home and you just immediately feel welcome, and they are so generous. And so I think Yeah, I think that's, that's one way. I also think about things like when I was growing up that like stuck with me. Like, for instance, we grew up across the street from these really elderly neighbors. Like, they were in their 80s when we moved in, and I was 4. My sister was just born. And my mom ended up striking up a very strong friendship with this woman, but basically, like, every time my mom went to the grocery store, she'd take, Mary with us. Or like if Mary was like not doing well, my mom would like go do all her shopping for her or help her clean up the house. And we would go and Mary would watch us. And like, it was that relationship that I saw. And I was like, that's what neighbors and community should be.
Yeah.
Or I also think about like my mom, there's a place called Meat Farms. It was like a grocery store, and like there'd be elderly people like waiting for the bus, and my mom would like pick them up and like drive them. And I now think back, like I'm like, oh god, I never, I mean, not that a senior citizen's gonna like attack me,
but it's just what they want you to
right,
think.
exactly. But it's like it's different, right? But those are things that like resonate in my mind of like watching. Like, it wasn't like my mom was trying to be like, see what we should do, but it was that she did it that has like shaped that thought for me, right?
Yeah, right.
I think one of the other things that kind of sparks for me is, and where I think there's a real downfall, and I don't know where the turn really happened, but in today's society, we pay everyone for everything. And I find that to like really negate the fabric of a community, right?
Yes,
like I was saying our neighbors like have dogs, right? And they like, I saw them post and they occasionally like need someone to come watch the dogs, or like we went away and like having someone water our flowers, right? Like, I feel like it's like uncomfortable. Like for me, I was gonna like ask our next door neighbor to like, oh, would you like swing by and water the flowers? But like I ended up being like, maybe I'll ask the kids across the street and I'll pay them, right? But like that, it's like a transactional, even though we're all friendly, that makes it like transactional, where I want to be like, hey, you don't have to pay someone to come like let your dogs out. Like, I'm happy to do that. Or, if you need something, like, let me help you to do that. And I think we saw a surge of that during COVID when we watched like, when we were living in DC, and there was like, our neighborhood was, people who maybe were more vulnerable. Like, it was like, can I pick you up from the grocery store? Some lady was making masks for everybody for free. People were giving away like, hey, I just like pruned my whatever herbs. Like, and so
I think that one thing about that is trying to think back to the beginning, like that period, you literally weren't allowed to like leave your house,
right?
Except like you were permitted like short walks for like fresh air, and then go back in your house, but like, so it was literally the people like within 100 yards of you were the only people you saw. And so all of that, like, I'm gonna like have some professional dog walker swing by was not an option,
right? And it forced us to really know our neighbors that we probably wouldn't have hung out with otherwise.
That is interesting,
because you're usually like, and so I think that kind of reinforced for me like how, I mean, it was such, in some ways, a really wonderful time, right? People were banding together. But there are still people that can't leave their house. Like it's like now put yourself, like, that was us for like a short amount of time. There are like elderly people in your community that maybe like are homebound or can't get out, right? Why are we not continuing that support and building those relationships with people to kind of check in on them and help them? And that's something I really want to help build in our neighborhood and beyond, right? Is like, hey, like, you need to go run to the store for milk. Like, I should know your kids well enough to be able to be like, I'll sit with them for 20 minutes, right. Where it's just, that is like not a common occurrence, I think, anymore.
I think that's true. Yeah. Okay. How about, let's go to the next psychological need. We're now on level 4 out of 5 on Maslow's original hierarchy. Esteem. Self-esteem, as well as like feeling respected by others.
So I think that this is really like, this is like the essential point of like a well-functioning human being, right? Like your own self-esteem and feeling appreciated by others. And I think that
well, Maslow would say it's the second most important thing, but yes.
So I think that is it's interesting to look at that over time. And also, like, so for instance, going back to belonging and love for a second.
Yeah.
Like when you think about that over the phases of life, interesting to run that parallel to parenting trends and advice that we have seen over time, right?
Yeah.
So 1, belonging and love, where is the line between like building that and overdoing it? Where is it immediately made me think of like with infants, right? Or like toddlers, the cry it out method. Like just like you put them in their room and you close the door and you let them cry. Like, and I'm like, is that, and some people say like that is like, that it, like at what point do you think like, does that undermine a child's like feeling of, from the very beginning, feeling of love and belonging, or not?
Just that, but I think like safety.
Right. And so I think like at one point, like I'm
not saying that's objectively true, but one thing I have struggled with the concept of the cried out method.
Yeah.
So I think if you do that too early, I'm suspicious. I think it is entirely plausible, but I don't have enough like data or evidence to assert that this is the fact. But I think that oftentimes infants want to be reassured that they like haven't been abandoned on the jungle floor. Right. Like my troop of gorillas didn't move on to the next copse of trees and forget me here. Like that's why I cry in the middle of the night.
Right.
And so I think sometimes an infant really just needs to be reassured, like, oh yeah, my mom is still here. I can go back to sleep now. And so I think like depriving them of that, intuitively to me, that does seem like you are depriving them of their need to know that they are safe.
But I think, like, you know, we think about our original parenting coach, Chinyere, who was our like birthing coach.
Yeah.
And like that's exactly what she said, right? It's like infants don't cry they do not cry to manipulate you. They do not cry for no reason. There is a need that they have. Now, granted, there are lots of situations, right? My sister went through where like our niece had like severe allergies. She was just really in pain. Yeah. And at some point, like you can't hold your kid. Like you have to balance, right? Like in order to provide for their basic needs, you need to get sleep. So maybe you are letting them cry it out. But just like in terms of, you know, but then at what point does that shift where we have a 16-month-old son that still does not sleep through the night and we won't let him cry at all because now we've shifted probably past like the psychological need, and it's just like I'm babying him because he's my baby.
Yeah, right.
And because it's easier to be like, let me just like rock him for a little bit versus like letting him cry. And then just because they all share a room, right? Yeah. He has sisters that he's going to wake. So all of these things kind of go into that.
I would say, I suspect, again, like we are not experts in this area, but it is my understanding, it is my intuition based on what limited knowledge we do have, that he's old enough now where he doesn't need to be reassured that he's safe. I think he knows he's safe.
Right.
I think he wants to be soothed. Mm-hmm. But I think we're at the point now where by us continuing to like coddle him in that way, he is prepared to develop a sense of like, I can soothe myself. I can roll over myself. I don't need like somebody else to hold me and sing me a song. Like,
then we might be detrimental in his like esteem and his own sense of value of like, I can do this by myself.
Exactly.
Not like I need my mom to.
Yeah. Now again, like, so you and I are, I think, aligned that like there is an age that's too young to try to like develop an independence in your child. Like if you have a 2-month-old baby and you're trying to be like, hey, you know, toughen up there, kiddo. Like that's probably not the right answer. But treating a 2-year-old like they're 2 months old is probably also not the right answer. So I don't know exactly where those benchmarks or like developmental milestones are, but I mean, I think we're basically aligned on like that is actually a good example of where the like application of the principles shifts as a child, you know, grows and develops. Right. Yeah.
And so then going into esteem, right? Like now, like going up to that next level of child, right? Like right now we have a 6 and a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
And what I mentioned earlier, and I'd like to dig into that a little bit with you, which is how do we build their internal sense of value and their belief that like they matter?
Yeah.
Please pardon the interruption. We will resume momentarily.
We're back. I apologize for losing video there for a minute. To recap what we might have lost, we've completed our working through Maslow's hierarchy, specifically discussing how the family can effectively help children fill the needs of their basic needs, physiological and safety needs, and then we spend a lot of time on their psychological needs, their sense of belonging and feeling love and developing self-esteem, as well as feeling a sense of esteem in their community. And to put a bow on how the family can help children be on the path toward self-actualization, we were discussing how, particularly for children that are the age of ours, we are trying to help them explore the world around them and like different interests and opportunities and activities that may become for them the thing that they're passionate about. Can you think forward to, like, as they're older, is there any form in which you anticipate like that shifting or like adding on to sort of those, like right now we're basically just saying like we're exposing them to extracurriculars and sports and that kind of stuff, but what can you, and maybe we just can't foresee it yet, but I wonder, like when they're teenagers or they're getting ready for, like they're, you know, graduating from high school is on the horizon, what do you think it will look like for us to guide them toward really feeling like they have, they're on a promising path toward like feeling actualized? What did that look like for you when you were a adolescent?
Well, I think it's a combination of guidance and support, and that, like, I think it's very hard to be self-actualized if you're being pushed into the thing, right? Like if you're like, my parents were doctors and they're telling me I'm going to be a doctor, and like to me, self-actualization has a piece of self-determination, because like if you're fulfilling your ultimate potential, right? Then that has to, there's something that from within that has to match that. Now, I think like as parents, as part of our job is to like know our children and push them where we see their strengths, or, you know, like, because I think as a kid, right, you're 17, 18 years old, you don't even know what possibility there is out there professionally,
right.
You know, extracurricular, personally, you know, all of that. But I think it, you know, it is a like building blocks over time of both like us modeling a positive relationship, which I think is an important thing as you come to your self-actualization, is like also like the self-actualization of you as a future couple, right? So like understanding that. I think there's the piece of, you know, like their professional aspirations and their responsibility to the community. Like all of those things can't be something you start talking to them about at 16.
Yeah, right.
Maybe that's when you start talking about it, and that's what, but like you have to have that has to be built on like the years prior. And so I think part of it is like just recognizing as you're doing things that your children are always watching your actions, your activities, the things you choose to spend your time on. Like all of those things will shape your children for better or worse, right? You may do something that really shapes your child to say, I don't want to do that. Yeah. And so like part of it is like being like helping yourself to get to this level so that you can then model their ability to get there. So
that's I think we're going to come back to that. That's an interesting point. But like you can't model it if you yourself are not effectively doing it. So let's come back to that here in a minute. But one thing I wanted to sort of touch on here is nowhere in Maslow's hierarchy is there, like, they don't talk about happiness. And I think I'm just trying to throw some controversial observation out there that I think we talk a lot today about like whether or not people are happy, like do what makes you happy.
Yeah.
I don't think that is part of Maslow's hierarchy. So either Maslow's hierarchy is wrong, or the societal messaging of like doing what makes you happy is at most like sort of extraneous, but maybe even like distracting from like what's fulfilling.
But don't you think that if you are fulfilled, you are happy?
No.
Huh.
No. Right. I think that like doing something you think is meaningful is not the same thing as doing something that you like find pleasure in. I think there are a lot of people who dedicate themselves to work that they believe is meaningful. It gives them purpose, but it is not enjoyable. I don't think Mother Teresa was like constantly like in a state of like, she was real upbeat all the time. I think she was dealing with like a lot of like real miserable situations. And I think she was hopeful and optimistic, but not like, I'm just like doing things that make me happy.
Yeah.
Do you think Mother Teresa is a bad example?
Yes.
Martin Luther King. I don't think he was like happy all the time.
Yeah.
I don't think he was pursuing happiness.
Yeah.
I think he was self-actualized.
Okay.
Why are you reluctant and resistant to what I'm saying?
Because I think we're like, happiness, maybe part of it is that it is a like, it's almost a subjective word, right? It's like happiness, because like I'm like, the way I'm defining happiness is what makes me happy, which is being fulfilled and living a fulfilling, purpose-filled life. And I would say that probably brought, happiness is not to say it is a constant state, but I'm pretty sure that like being a leader in the civil rights movement probably brought Martin Luther King Jr. some happiness, right? It is like it is fulfilling, it is soul fulfilling to do that. It's not to say, again, kind of what we talked about the other day, it's not to say something because something's hard, it isn't like worthwhile or enjoyable or any, it's just like there's going to be parts that are hard.
Yeah.
Like, and so I don't know, I have to think about your example.
That's all the time we have for today. This week we explored the definition and purpose of family, settling on a draft working definition that a family is a group of people who share emotional, material, and financial resources in order to provide for the flourishing of its members, helping them to progress through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, ultimately cultivating human flourishing, while simultaneously contributing to the well-being of neighboring families, communities, society at large, and future families. Next week, we will turn our attention to how these concepts can shed light on the definition and purpose of marriage. That episode will air the second Wednesday of September, September 14th. In the meantime, we will release a bonus episode. Last week's discussion included reference to the generations, milestones, and cultural developments of the 20th and early 21st century. The bonus episode will clarify each of those generational contributions to the development of those institutions over the last 100 years. As always, we invite you to connect with us via social media on TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, Instagram, and Facebook. Please find the links in the show notes. Until next time, happy homemaking.
Thank you so much for attending today's discussion with Mr. Homemaker. Please take this opportunity to subscribe, like, and share this episode with your spouse, relatives, and friends. We further invite you to access complimentary information and resources at our website, mr-homemaker.com. There you will also find links to join the discussion via email or social media. And please, support the Mr. Homemaker podcast and receive merchandise and membership benefits on patreon.com. Until next time, farewell.